Most of us spend our lives certain that the loudest man in the room is the one who knows the most. We laugh along with the laughing. We point when the pointing starts. It is the easiest thing in the world, and it costs us nothing, until the night the cold comes in, and we find out who actually understood something all along. This is a true feeling account of one such winter, written down by a man who was not proud of the part he played in it. I am that man, and I will not soften my share of it. If you have ever mocked something you didn't understand, only to learn later that the joke was on you, then you already know how this story sits in the chest. Stay with it. The part that matters is not the laughing. It's what the cold reveals about all of us when the laughing stops. I keep a logbook, always have. A man who runs cattle in high country learns fast that memory is a liar and a willow tally stick doesn't argue with you. So when I tell you what happened the winter Dahana built his wind trap, I'm not leaning on the soft and flattering version of myself that the years would prefer. I am reading off the page. And the page says in my own cramped hand on the 11th of that November, Indians chimney foolishness. Whole crew near split their sides. Cold coming. 3 lines. I read them now and I want to take the pen and drive it through the paper. But I'm getting ahead. Let me start where the cold started, because that's where the truth of it lives, not in the warm aftermath, but in the first bite of it, when none of us yet knew what we were looking at. It was a gray morning, the kind where the sky sits down low over the valley like a wet wool blanket and refuses to lift. We were strung out along the Shenegula, a thin creek that ran cold and clear off the high country and gathered to itself a scatter of cabins, a corral, a smithy gone half to ruin, and the assorted wrecks and hopefuls who'd come to make the territory pay. I had 40 head of cattle and a cabin I'd built myself, which is to say a cabin that leaked at every joint and let the wind walk through it like the wind owned the deed. Dahana lived at the edge of all that, not in it, at the edge. I should tell you about Dahana, because the men who laughed at him never bothered to. He was Apache, Chiricahua, I came to understand, though by the time I knew him the word Chiricahua had been made into something the army said with its teeth clenched. He had a face like the country itself, weathered, unhurried, hard to read until you'd spent some time learning the language of it. He was not young. There was gray coming into his hair and a stiffness in one knee that he never spoke of and never favored, as though he'd decided long ago that pain was a thing you could simply choose not to discuss. He did work for whoever would pay him, and a good deal of work for people who wouldn't, because he was the sort of man who could not watch a fence sag without fixing it. He spoke English better than most of us spoke anything. He just chose not to spend it freely. A man who has had words used against him his whole life gets careful with his own. I understand that now. At the time I thought he was simply slow, and God forgive me, I think I let it show on my face. He had a quirk, and I record it here because it's the first thing that ever made me look at him twice. He listened to the wind, not the way a poet listens, all sighs and meaning. He listened the way a doctor listens to a chest. He would stop, mid-stride, mid-task, mid-anything, and tilt his head, and his eyes would go far off, and you understood that some part of him was tracking a thing the rest of us couldn't hear. The men called him Old Whistler for it, and worse. I called him nothing. I just watched. Now the chimney. It started in late October, when the first real cold slid down off the peaks and rattled everybody's teeth and sent everybody's wood smoke down their own throats. Because here's a thing nobody tells you about cabins in high country. A stove or a fire is not the problem. Anyone can make heat. The problem is the cold air, which is heavier and sneakier and which finds the gap under your door, the chink between your logs, the place where your stovepipe meets the roof and never quite sealed. The problem is the draft, the river of cold that runs along the floor and steals the warmth straight out from under you faster than you can make it. You can burn a cord of wood a night and still wake with frost in your beard, because the heat went up and out and the cold came in low and stayed. Every man on the Shenegula fought this the same way. We stuffed rags in the gaps. We banked dirt against the walls. We hung blankets. We burned more wood than we could afford to cut, and we cursed the cold like it was a personal enemy who'd insulted our mothers. Dahana did something else. I first saw it when I rode past his place hauling a load of pinyon. He had taken apart one whole wall of the linta he wintered in, and he was building, there's no other word for it, building something into it. A double wall was my first thought, a wall with a hollow in it. And running up through the hollow, a kind of throat of fitted stone and mudded wood, with openings I couldn't make sense of, a low one near the floor on the outside, and a higher one inside near where his fire would sit, and slats he could open and close. I reined up. I'm not proud of what I said. I said something like, "What in the hell are you doing, Whistler? Building a chimney that goes sideways?" He didn't look up. He fitted a stone, tested it with his thumb, took it out, turned it, set it back. Then he said, without any heat at all, "Air is an animal, you don't fight it. You give it a road and tell it where to go." I laughed. God help me, I laughed, because it was the kind of thing that sounded like nonsense if you decided in advance that the man saying it was a fool. Air is an animal. I rode on, and at the bunkhouse that night, we'd a sort of common room at Coyne's place where the unmarried men gathered to drink and lie. I repeated it, and I did the voice, the slow, grave voice, and the men howled. That's the moment my logbook is sneering at. Whole crew near split their sides. Let me give them to you, the crew, because mockery is never just one man. It's a weather of its own. There was Coyne, who owned the place and the still and most of everyone's debts, a big red man with a laugh like a barrel rolling downstairs. There was the Prout brothers, two narrow boys from Missouri who never had an idea between them and made up for it with volume. There was old Tam, the smith, who was the only one of us who'd actually built anything that lasted and who therefore should have known better, and who didn't. And there was me. I want that on the record. I was not standing apart, arms folded, the wise observer. I was in it. I held the lantern for the joke. I did the voice. "Sideways chimney," Coyne wheezed. "He'll smoke himself like a ham." "Air's a animal," one of the Prouts brayed. "Reckon you gotta lasso it." And so on, and worse, late into the night, the way men's cruelty deepens with drink and with the cold pressing on the windows because, and this is the part it took me years to understand, we were afraid. The cold scared us. It scared all of us every winter the way it kills slow and stupid men in their sleep without raising its voice. And here was a man we'd been raised to look down on, calmly building something we didn't understand as though he weren't afraid at all, as though he knew something. That was unbearable. So we laughed the way frightened men do, to make ourselves bigger than the thing we feared. I see all that now. I saw none of it then. The next morning my head hurt and the cold had teeth. I rode out to check my northernmost cattle and my route took me past Dahana's lean-to again, and the wall was done, or near done, and there was a thread of smoke coming off it. And here's the thing that snagged in me, the small detail that I wrote down that night, the detail that started everything. The smoke went up clean, straight up, a thin gray line into the gray sky, no billow, no backwash, no choking. And his door was open in that cold. And as I rode past I felt, I swear it, a faint breath of warm air slide out of that open door across the frozen yard. I stopped. He was inside, sitting by a fire that was, I counted, I'm a man who counts, about a third the size of the fire I'd been feeding all night. A small fire, and he had his coat off. "Cold out," he said, not turning around. He'd heard my horse. He heard everything. "How's it warm in here?" I said. It came out flat, almost angry. I didn't like the feeling that was crawling up my spine, which was the feeling of having been wrong about something while laughing very hard. He was quiet a while. Then he gestured with two fingers at the low opening near the floor, the one that let in from outside. "Cold comes in there," he said, "down low, where it wants to go. It is heavy, the cold, it wants the floor." He moved his fingers up, tracing the hollow in the wall. "But I make it go past the fireside first, long way up the warm wall, so when it comes into the room," his hand opened slow, like releasing a bird, "it is not cold no more. It is warm. The fire warms the road, and the road warms the air, and the warm air comes to me already friendly." I stood in the doorway like a stump. "And the smoke?" he went on, and now, I'll be honest, now there was the faintest dry curl at the corner of his mouth because he knew exactly what he was doing to me. The smoke wants up. So I give it a tall straight road and a small mouth, and it pulls itself out, and pulling itself out it pulls fresh air in behind it. The fire breathes. A fire that breathes good needs little wood. He fed one small stick to the small fire. Your fire is choking. You are feeding a choking animal. It eats and stays hungry and cold. I want to describe to you what it is to be 29 years old and full of yourself, and to have a man you've spent a night mocking explain in plain words in a language not his own, a thing that you and every man you know have gotten wrong your entire lives. It is not a good feeling. It does not feel like learning. Not at first. It feels like a slap. Pride is a coward and a bully, and it does not go down easy. It thrashes. I felt my face go hot, and I heard myself, to my everlasting shame, say something small. I said, "Well, we'll see how your animal does when the real cold comes." He looked at me then, full on, and there was no anger in it, which was somehow worse. There was a kind of patience, the patience of a man who has been doubted by experts his whole life and has stopped expecting otherwise. "Yes," he said, "we will see." I rode home, and that night the temperature fell out of the bottom of the world. The first hard freeze of that winter came 3 days later, and it came the way they do in the high country, not as a storm, not yet, but as a stillness. A terrible clear stillness. The wind died, the sky scoured itself empty, and the heat just left, radiated straight up into a black bowl of stars with nothing to hold it down. By midnight the creek was groaning as it iced. By the small hours my cabin was a misery. I had banked my fire high. I had stuffed every gap I could find. And still the cold came in low along the floor, a slow, invisible flood, and pooled around my feet and climbed my legs, and the heat from my roaring fire went straight up and out the bad seal of my stovepipe, and I lay in my bunk under every blanket I owned and watched my own breath and shook. I thought about him. I couldn't help it. I thought about the small fire and the open door and the warm breath crossing the frozen yard. The fire warms the road, and the road warms the air. I lay there feeding a choking animal, and I hated that I understood now exactly what he'd meant, and I hated even more that understanding it didn't warm me 1 degree, because knowing a thing and having built it are 2 different countries, and I lived in the wrong one. I got up before dawn because there was no point pretending to sleep. I built the fire higher. I made coffee with hands that wouldn't quite work, and through my one frost-blinded window I saw, across the valley, the other cabins, and over each one the same sight. Wood smoke pouring out thick and low and beaten flat by the cold, a great wasteful smudge of it, every man on the Shenanigans burning his winter's wood in a single night to fight a battle the cold was patiently winning. And over Dahana's lean-to, that thin clean line, going straight up, same as before. I want to tell you I rode straight over and apologized and asked him to teach me. I want to tell you I was a better man than I was. But pride, remember, is a coward that thrashes, and mine wasn't done thrashing yet, and there was more cold coming. The still kind was only the front edge of it. And worse than the cold, there were the men, and what the men would do when laughing stopped being enough. Because here is the thing I had not yet reckoned with, the thing that turns a story about a clever chimney into a story about people. It is one matter for a man to be proven wrong in private, in his own freezing cabin, where only he and his logbook know. It is another matter entirely when a whole community of frightened, prideful, cold men begins slowly, resentfully, to suspect that the one they laughed at was right. Some men faced with that learn. Some men faced with that get mean. And I had a sick feeling, sitting there with my coffee going cold in my hands before I could even drink it, watching that thin, clean line of smoke rise off the lean-to at the edge of everything, that I knew which kind of men the Shenanigans was full of. I wrote 3 lines in my logbook that morning too. I'll give you the first 2. Froze near to death. Whole valley did. His chimney drew clean all night, I'd stake my hand on it. The 3rd line I'm not ready to give you yet. It's about what old Tam said at the smithy that afternoon, and what the Prout brothers did with it, And the way Coin went quiet, Coin, who never went quiet in a way that frightened me more than any shouting could have. But that's the next part of it. For now I'll only say this. The cold reveals things. That's its one mercy and its one cruelty. It had already shown me the truth about a chimney and about a man, and though I'd have denied it then with my last breath about myself, lying sleepless and shaking and stubborn in a cabin I'd built wrong, too proud to walk across a frozen yard toward the one warm door in the whole valley. I promised you the third line of my logbook, the one I wasn't ready to give. Here it is, cop it exact, in my cramped hand from that afternoon at the smithy. Tam says burn him out, Prout's laughing, Coin said nothing. God help us, Coin said nothing. You have to understand the smithy to understand that line. Old Tam's forge was the warmest place on the Shenegula that didn't belong to an Apache, and so it was where the men gathered when the cold got serious, crowding into the orange heat shimmer, stamping their feet, holding their hands to the coals. It was the village's church and its tavern and its court of bitter opinion, all at once. And on that afternoon, the afternoon after the great clear freeze that had near killed every one of us in our beds, the talk turned to Dahana. It turned because it had to. Every man there had spent the night losing a fight, and every man there had seen, come morning, that thin clean line of smoke rising untroubled off the lean-to. You cannot make grown men feel small without consequence. The smallness has to go somewhere. And in men like the Prouts, in men like Tam, and yes, in men like the one I was then, it goes outward, looking for a target. It ain't natural, Tam said, working the bellows so the coals breathed and flared. He was the only craftsman among us, the only one who'd built things that held, and that made his words carry weight they didn't deserve. A fire don't burn that small and warm a place. He's doing something. He's doing building, I said. I'd like to tell you I said it loud and proud, the lone voice of reason. I said it into my collar, half under my breath, and only one man heard me, and that man was Coin, and Coin looked at me. A long, flat, considering look. I shut my mouth. Indian medicine, one Prout offered helpfully. Whatever it is, said Tam, and here he set down his hammer and the forge went quiet but for the coals. I say a place like this don't need that kind of man getting ideas. Don't need folks looking at him and thinking he's got something we ain't. You let that start, you don't know where it stops. He let that sit. Then lighter like a joke, except it wasn't a joke. None of us thought it was a joke. Be a shame if that leaned to caught a spark some night. Awful dry wood. The Prouts laughed. It was an ugly laugh, the kind that's testing the air to see if it's allowed. And Coin, big Coin, loud Coin, Coin who had a comment for everything and a laugh like a barrel down the stairs, Coin said nothing. He stared into the coals, and his silence was the loudest thing in that smithy, because we all knew that Coin held most of our debts, and Coin's silence was the closest thing the Shenegula had to law, and his silence right then was not a no. I rode home sick to my stomach, not brave, sick. There's a difference, and I won't pretend at the first when I only managed the second. The storm came 2 days later, and it did not announce itself the way the clear freeze had. It came howling. I have lived through weather. I have seen a sky turn green and spit hail the size of hens' eggs. But I had never seen, have never since seen, anything like the wall of white that came down off the peaks that afternoon. One moment the day was gray and still and sullen. The next, the mountains simply vanished, erased behind a roaring gray-white nothing that swallowed the high pastures and came on across the valley faster than a horse could run. The wind hit my cabin like a shoulder. The whole structure groaned and shifted on its sills. And then the snow, not falling but flying, sideways, horizontal. 1,000 small knives of it driven through every gap in my walls so that the inside of my own home filled with a fine sifting smoke of snow. I did what every man in that valley did. I built my fire as high as it would go. I jammed myself into the corner farthest from the door, and I prepared to fight for my life against the cold, the only way I knew how, by burning everything I had and hopping it lasted till the wind died. It did not look like it was going to die. And then through the howl, I heard a thing that doesn't belong in a blizzard. I heard a child crying. I want to slow down here because this is the hinge of it, the moment the whole winter turned on, and I've gone over it 1,000 times. The crying was thin and torn by the wind, and it came from outside, from the direction of the creek crossing, and my first thought, God forgive the animal that lives in a frightened man. My first thought was not my problem. Stay by the fire. You'll die out there. That thought is real, and I record it so you'll trust the rest. But under it, lower and steadier, was another thing, and I have come to believe that other thing is the only part of me worth keeping. I was already pulling on my coat before I'd finished being a coward. The child was the Hadley girl. Sarah Hadley, 7 years old, the daughter of a couple who'd taken a claim 2 miles up the creek, too far out, too alone, the way the desperate and the hopeful always settle too far out. I found her not 50 yards from my own door, sunk to her waist in a drift, blue-lipped, her cries gone down to a kind of hiccuping whimper that frightened me far more than screaming would have. She'd come for help. Her father had gone through the creek ice that morning, and her mother was alone with him and couldn't leave him, and had sent the child, sent a 7-year-old into the teeth of that storm, because there was no other hand to send. I got her up. I got her against my chest inside my coat, and I turned back toward my cabin, and I could not find it. I want you to understand that. I had walked 50 yards from a building I'd built with my own hands, and the white had closed behind me like water, and I could not find my own door. The wind had no direction in it. There was no up, no valley, no peaks, no creek, only the roar and the knives and a small cold body going slack against my chest. I am alive to write this because a man I had mocked came out into that and found us. I never heard him. You never do with him. The first I knew, a hand closed on my shoulder, hard, certain, the grip of a man who knew exactly where he was when no one else on earth could, and Dahana's face was a foot from mine, snow-crusted, calm, and he put his mouth to my ear and said one word. Come. He had a rope. Of course he had a rope. He tied one end to his linta before he came out, while the rest of us were cowering. This man had thought it through, had rigged a lifeline into the storm on the chance someone might need pulling out of it, and he led us back along it hand over hand, me clutching the child, him clutching me, the rope the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved. And then we were through his door, and the door shut behind us, and the world stopped roaring. I have to tell you what it was like inside, because it is the whole point, and because I have never been able to make the men who weren't there understand it. It was warm. Not survivable, not bearable, warm. The kind of warm where you take your coat off. There was a small fire, that same small, almost insulting little fire, burning clean and steady in its hearth, and there was no smoke in the air, none, your eyes didn't sting, and there was no cold river along the floor, none, and when you put your hand near the base of that strange double wall you could feel it. A slow, gentle, ceaseless breath of warm air sliding up out of the floor vents into the room. The blizzard was trying to murder the entire valley, and inside that lean, to it was a problem the building had simply, quietly solved. The cold air was coming in. It had to. A sealed room would have smothered him. The cold was pouring down the outer intake near the floor. I could feel its bitterness if I put my fingers right at the mouth of it, but by the time it had been led all the way up the long throat of the warm wall, past the fireside, around and up, it came out the inner vents already gentled, already friendly, the chill cooked out of it on the journey. The fire warms the road, and the road warms the air. I'd heard him say it. I'd laughed at it across a bunkhouse. Now I was sitting on the floor of the proof of it with a child coming back to life against my chest, and I started, to my own surprise, to weep. He let me. He didn't look at me while I did it, which I've come to understand was a kindness, his way of giving a man back his dignity by pretending not to see it leave. He took the Hadley girl from me, gentle, so gentle, the same hands that fitted stone, and he did not pile her by the fire, which is what I'd have done and which would have shocked her frozen blood and maybe killed her. He warmed her slow. He set her near the wall vents where the heat came soft and even, wrapped her in a blanket that had been hung to warm, and he chafed her hands and her feet with a patience that did not break for 1 second, and he talked to her low and steady in a mix of English and his own tongue. And the words didn't matter, the steadiness mattered, and I watched the blue go out of her lips, and the whimper turn to a whimper, then a word, then a question, and I understood I was watching a man who had done this before. Many times, who knew cold the way Tam knew iron, who had spent a life learning to keep people alive in country that wanted them dead, and had been laughed at in that same life by men who would have died in their beds the night before if the weather had pressed just a little harder. Her father, I managed. He went through the ice, up creek, her mother's alone with him. Dahana went still, that listening stillness. Then he looked at the door and at the storm screaming on the other side of it, and I saw him weigh it, saw him do the arithmetic that every decent person dreads and most never have to do out loud. 2 miles. In that. A man who'd gone through ice that morning was either alive or he wasn't, and going out meant maybe not coming back. And there was a living child here, warm and safe, who needed someone, and a wife up the creek who needed someone, and one of him. I can't ask you to, I said, and meant it, and was ashamed of how relieved part of me felt to have said it. He almost smiled, that dry curl. You did not ask, he said. And here is the part where the story turns from a story about being warm into a story about what a person is willing to spend, and on whom. Because Dahana looked at his lifeline rope, and at his warm, safe room, and at the child, and at me, a man who had done the voice, who had held the lantern for the joke, who belonged body and soul to the smithy crowd that had 2 days ago discussed burning his home down around him. And he made a decision that I did not deserve to witness. You stay, he said, keep her by the wall, not the fire. Feed the fire small, you understand. 2 sticks, no more. You make it big, you ruin the draw, you fill the room with smoke, and you kill her and yourself both. Small. He was already pulling his coat back on, already coiling a second rope. The road takes care of the rest. Trust the road. You can't go alone. I always go alone, he said. There was no self-pity in it. It was just a fact about his life, stated plain, and it landed in me like a stone going into deep water. I always go alone. Of course he did. We'd made sure of it. We'd built a whole little world out here whose first principle was that this man went alone. I'd the rope to his belt. He looked at the fire, and then he did a thing I'll never forget. He laughed, short, real, his breath puffing in the doorway's cold. 2 days ago, he said, Tam wants to burn this house. Now it keeps his neighbor's child alive while he hides by his forge. He shook his head, almost wondering. The cold is a great teacher. It does not care who you laugh at. And then the dry curl again, aimed at me. Small fire, small. You burned a cord a night, I know it. I saw your smoke. Do not embarrass yourself in front of a child. And he was gone into the white. I will not pretend the next hours were anything but the longest of my life. I kept the fire small. It went against everything in me, every instinct. I had screamed more wood, more heat, build it up, and I had to physically sit on my own hands more than once to keep from feeding it, because I understood now, finally, in my bones, that the heat was not the point. The air was the point. The road was the point. I fed it 2 sticks. I watched the smoke draw clean and felt the warm breath rise from the floor. And I held the Hadley girl, who woke fully and asked for her mother, and then, when I had no good answer, asked instead about the wall, how is it warm, mister? Where's the warm coming from? And I found myself explaining it to her. This thing I'd mocked in Dahana's own words. Air is an animal, you give it a road. And her eyes went wide and she said, that's clever, with the total uncomplicated honesty of a child, and I thought. Yes, it is. It always was. It took a near-frozen 7-year-old about 4 seconds to grant the man the simple respect that the grown men of this valley had withheld for a season out of nothing but fear and pride. I watched the door. The storm did not slacken. If anything, it deepened toward dark, the howl rising to something almost musical, almost like the wind had words in it. And I sat in the one warm room on the Shenegala, in the proof of a quiet man's quiet genius, keeping his small fire small, holding a child he'd risked everything to save. and I waited to learn whether he was coming back, and whether, if he did, he'd be carrying a living man, a dead one, or grief he'd gone 2 miles into a killing storm to gather for a family that wasn't even his. The latch lifted near full dark. I won't tell you yet what came through that door. I'll only tell you that the wind that came in with it carried the smell of the creek, of wet wool and wood smoke and something darker under it, and that Dahana's face, when I saw it in the small, clean firelight, was a face I'd never seen him wear, and that whatever he'd found up that creek, and whatever he'd had to decide once he found it, had cost him something the cold never could. He set his burden down inside the door. And then he looked at the small fire, still drawing clean, still keeping us all alive, and his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the way a man's do when the one thing he was sure of turns out, after all, to have held. "Good," he said, very quiet. "You trusted the road." That was part 2. The hardest part is still ahead, not the cold, but what the men did when the storm cleared and they came out of their cabins and saw what one mocked house had done, and what Dahana decided to do with that, and the price of it. The burden he set down inside the door was John Hadley, and John Hadley was alive. Barely. The man had gone through the creek ice that morning hunting a strayed milk cow, and his wife Ruth had hauled him out and dragged him to the cabin and stripped him and packed him in every blanket they owned and her own coat besides. And still, by the time Dahana reached the place, Hadley was so far down into the cold that he'd stopped shivering. And if you know anything about freezing, you know that the stopping of the shivering is not the good sign it feels like. It is the body giving up the argument. Dahana laid him by the warm wall, not the fire, not the fire, I understood now, the way you understand a hard lesson you've paid for, and he looked at me and his face was wrong. I'd never seen his face wrong. It had cost him something out there, and the something was this. "The woman," he said, "she would not come. She said, 'Carry him, he is the one dying. I am strong, come back for me.'" He said it flat, but his hands were not flat, his hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "I said I come back, the storm," he stopped. He looked at the door. "It is worse now than when I went, much worse. I do not know if I find the rope's end again." And there it was, the arithmetic laid out plain on the floor of that warm room. A dying man saved. A living woman 2 miles off in a storm that had deepened past the point where any sane creature ventured into it, who had given up her own coat and her own warmth, and traded her safety for her husband's on the gamble of one Apache's word. And one of him, already half spent, already having gone out and come back once through a thing that had nearly erased me at 50 yards. He was going to go. I could see he was going to go. He was checking his rope, his hands shaking, his face set, a man preparing to spend the last of himself on a promise made to a stranger who'd never once defended him. And I want to tell you about the thing that happened in me then, because it is the only thing in this whole account I am not ashamed of. I stood up. My legs didn't want to. The animal in me, the one that had thought not my problem when I first heard the child cry, that animal was screaming now, "Stay, you fool, you'll die, you have done enough, no one would blame you." And it was right. No one would have blamed me. That's the terrible thing about cowardice. It almost always has the better argument. "You're not going alone," I said. He looked at me. That long, flat, considering look, Coin's look, but without the menace in it, only a kind of weighing. "You will slow me," he said, "not cruel, honest." "Then I'll slow you," I said. "But you said it yourself, you always go alone." "Well, not tonight." Something moved in his face. I won't claim it was respect. I hadn't earned respect, not in a season, not from a man I'd helped make a stranger of in his own valley. But it was something. Maybe just surprise. Maybe the surprise was respect enough for that one night. "The girl," he said. "Warm. The fire's small. I'll bank it before we go. Show me again how small." And he did 2 sticks, and he showed me how to set the slats so the room would hold its breath while we were gone. And the Hadley girl, Sarah, looked up at the 2 of us pulling on our coats and said, in that flat, brave way children have, "Are you getting my mama?" And Dahana said, "Yes," and did not say "if we can," and I understood that the "if we can" was a thing you carried but did not set down in front of a child. We tied ourselves to the same rope, him in front, me behind, and we went out into the white. I'm not going to give you that 2 miles foot by foot. Some things you can't put on a page. You can only say they happened and let the page carry the weight of how little it can hold. I'll tell you that the storm was a living malice by then, that twice I lost the rope and twice his hand found my wrist before I'd finished falling, that the cold got into me so deep I stopped being able to tell which parts of me were still mine. I'll tell you that he navigated that erased world by things I couldn't perceive, the set of the wind, the slope underfoot, some interior compass built by a lifetime of moving through country that killed the unobservant, and that without him I would have walked in a circle until I lay down, and lying down died, the way the cold prefers to take you, agreeably, with your consent. We found the cabin because he found the cabin, and Ruth Hadley was alive because she was a stubborn woman who had refused to lie down, who had kept herself moving in that freezing dark for hours by sheer animal spite, walking the tiny room, slapping her own arms, because she had a child somewhere in the storm and a promise to wait for, and she would be damned. She told us later, she would be damned if she'd die before she knew. Endurance. I have used that word lightly in my life. I will never use it lightly again. I watched what it actually looks like, on the floor of that cabin, in the body of a woman who would not quit, and I have measured every hardship since against the night Ruth Hadley outstubborned a blizzard with nothing but rage and love. Getting her back was worse than getting there. 3 on a rope, one of them failing, the storm at its absolute throat. There was a stretch, I'll be brief, where Dahana went down and didn't get up, just went down in the snow with his rope still in his fist, and I understood that the last of him had finally been spent, that he had given and there was no more, and that the dying agreeable cold was reaching for the only man among us who'd never once knelt to it. And it was Ruth Hadley, half-frozen Ruth Hadley, who got under his other arm with me, and the two of us, a coward learning late and a woman who would not quit, carried the man who'd come to save us the last quarter mile, following his own lifeline rope hand over hand to the warm door he'd built. We fell through it, all 3, and the room took us warm, clean, steady, that gentle breath rising from the floor. The small fire still drawing true the way I'd left it, and Sarah Hadley screamed Mama, and John Hadley, conscious now, wept, and I lay on the floor next to Dahana and watched his chest, watched it, willing it, and after a long, terrible moment it rose, and fell, and rose. He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling of his own house, and the dry curl came to the corner of his mouth, even then, even spent past the bottom of himself, and he said, in a thread of a voice, "You did not slow me so much." I laughed and it came out as a sob, both at once. There's a sound a man makes that's both, and I made it. "Small fire," he whispered, and his eyes closed, and he slept the sleep of a man who has given everything and against all odds and against all justice, gets to wake up after. The storm broke before dawn the way they do, all at once, the malice simply lifting, leaving behind a silence so total it rang. And when the sun came up over the peaks, it came up on a changed valley. I want to be careful here, because this is the part the men of the Shenegala least like to hear told true. We had lost cattle, all of us froze standing up, dozens of them, you'd find them in the spring still on their feet. We had lost the younger Prout boy, who'd gone out at the height of it to bring in firewood, his cabin's fire having eaten through his whole supply, and who got turned around 20 feet from his door, the way I'd been turned around, except no one came out on a rope for him. We found him when the snow melted off, that spring, not far from a wall he could have touched. And old Tam, the craftsman, the man whose forge was the warmest place a white man could stand. Tam had near burned his cabin to the ground at the height of it, feeding the fire higher and higher in a panic, exactly the choking animal Dahana had described to me weeks before, and only saved himself by going out into the storm to beat the flames off his own smoking wall, frost-bitten 3 fingers in the doing of it, fingers a smith cannot spare. And one house on the Shenegala had kept its small fire small, and breathed easy through the worst night any of us had ever seen, and had pulled 3 people back from the dead. The men came. Of course they came. They came the way the cold had taught them to, with their pride frostbitten down to the quick. They came to the lean-to at the edge of everything where they'd talked of throwing a spark, and they stood in the trampled snow, Coin and Tam with his bandaged hand and what was left of the Prutes and all the rest, and they could not look at me. I was inside. I was of that house now in their eyes, and they could not look at Dahana, who came to the door wrapped in a blanket, slow with the cost of the night, and looked at them with no expression at all. It was Tam who spoke. It would be Tam, the craftsman humbled, holding his ruined hand. "We want to know how it's built," he said. He couldn't manage please. That word had been bred out of men like us. But the want was naked in him, and the want was as close to please as he had. "The wall, the chimney. We want to know how it's built before next winter takes the rest of us." And here is the morally heavy thing. Here is the decision I watched a man make, the one I've turned over every day of my life since. Dahana had every right to shut the door. I want that understood fully before I tell you what he did. These men had laughed at him for a season. They had made him a stranger in country his people had walked for 1,000 years before any of ours arrived. Tam had spoken of burning him alive in his sleep, and Coin's silence had not been a no, and every man standing in that snow had either said the cruel thing or laughed at it, or, like me, stood by and let it happen. They had given him nothing but contempt, and now they stood at his door asking him to hand over the one thing that made them need him, after which they would not need him at all. He had every right, by every measure of justice I can find, to say no. Freeze. I built one warm house in a cold valley and you wanted to burn it. Build your own. He looked at them a long time. The valley was very quiet. Somewhere a frozen branch cracked in the rising warmth. Then he said, "Bring wood and stone, I will show you." I did not understand it then. I asked him that night, why? Why give it to them? And his answer is the thing I most want to set down before I'm done, because I have never improved on it. It was quiet a while, listening to the wind the way he did, the wind gentle now, almost kind. "The cold does not care who is right," he finally said. "It does not punish the cruel and spare the good. It killed the young one, the Prute boy, who laughed at me. It would have killed the child who never did. It is not on my side." He fed the small fire its small stick. "If I keep this from them, I am only one more thing in this valley that lets people die to make a point. There is enough of that already. There is too much of that." He looked at me. "My people are dying, Asaph, far from here. In a hot place the army sent them, where the wind does not bring rain and the children cough. I cannot save them. I could not save them." His voice did not break, it went very flat, which I'd learned was how it broke. "But I can keep a stranger's child warm. I can keep even Tam warm. It is a small thing. It is the only thing I have left that the army cannot take." A long pause. "So I will not keep it. I will not be one more man who let the cold do his cruelty for him." I had no answer. I have never found one. I only wrote it in my logbook, word for word as near as I could hold it, and I have read it on the worst days of my life. He showed them. All that long thawing week, Dahana stood in the cold and taught the men who'd mocked him how to build the thing they'd laughed at. He showed them the low intake and the high vent and the long warm road between, the small mouth that made the fire pull, the slats you set by the weather. He was patient past anything they deserved. The Prute that was left wept while he learned it, though he'd never have admitted to it, and I'll not name which one. Tam, who could build anything once he understood it fast and built it well, and never once thanked the man who taught him, because some men cannot, but built into his own wall, where no one would see. A small fitted stone in the Apache way that Dahana had shown him, and I think that stone was Tam's whole apology, the only kind he had. By the next winter, every cabin on the Shenegula breathed the way Dahana's did. Mine first. I tore out my whole north wall and built it again with his hands guiding mine, and that winter I burned a third of the wood and slept warm and woke without frost in my beard, and every clean breath of warm air rising off that floor was a thing I had laughed at once, doing the voice, holding the lantern for the joke. But here is the part the valley did not like told, and so I will tell it last and plainest. The men kept the wall, they did not keep the man. In the early spring, before the creek was fully open, the order came down. It had been coming for years. It came for all of them in the end that the few scattered Apaches still living free in the territory were to be gathered and sent east to Florida to a fort by a sea none of them had ever seen, to join the rest of the people Dahana had spoken of, the ones dying in the hot place where the wind brought no rain. An agent came with 2 soldiers. It was very orderly. There was a paper. Not one man on the Shenegula spoke up for him. I want to tell you I did. I have to live with the fact of what I did, which was follow the agent's horse a little way down the creek and say, my voice unsteady, that the man had saved 3 lives in the storm, that he'd taught the whole valley to survive, that surely that counted for something. And the agent, not unkind, only tired, only a man doing a job that men do, said that it was not a question of what the man had done. It was a question of what the man was. And those, he said, were different questions, and the second one had already been answered in an office by people who had never been cold a day in their lives. Dahana did not fight it. I think he had known it was coming the whole time, had known it maybe, even as he stood in the snow choosing to teach the men who would not lift a finger for him when the paper came. It is the only thing I have left that the army cannot take. He'd said that. He'd known. He gave away the one thing they couldn't take from him precisely because everything else already had been, or was about to be. He came to my cabin the morning they took him. He stood in the door of the warm house I'd built with his hands, and he looked at the wall, the clean, thin line of smoke he could see rising off it through my window, and the dry curl came one last time to the corner of his mouth. You kept the fire small, he said. I kept it small, I said. I could not say more. I was a coward to the end about the things that mattered most. I have made my peace with being a man who feels far more than he can ever get his mouth to carry. He nodded like that settled something. Then he said one more thing, and I have spent the rest of my life deciding what he meant by it, and I have decided that I will not decide, that some things you are meant to carry open and unanswered. He said, Air is an animal, Asa, you cannot cage it, you can only give it a road. A pause, the wind moved in the pinions. People are the same, remember that when they tell you a thing must be kept where it is put. Then he went out to the agent's horse, and he did not look back, and the valley he had kept warm watched him go and said nothing, and I stood in the door of my warm house and could not move, and the small fire drew clean and true behind me, the way it always did after that, the way it does to this day. I keep the logbook still. I read the 3 lines from that first November sometimes, the cruel ones in my own cramped hand. And I read the last entry I made of him, the morning they took him east, which is shorter than the others, because there was less and less I could find to say as the years pressed down, and I understood more and more of what I'd watched and how little of it I deserved to. The last line just says, he gave it to them anyway. I have never been able to write the next sentence.